The ships appeared out of the morning fog like they had been conjured from a nightmare. Not 5 ships, not 10, 120 longships, moving upriver in total silence, packed with nearly 7,000 warriors who had already burned everything between the coast and this moment. And Paris was next. The Frankish commanders on the riverbank stared at the Seine and felt something they had not felt in a generation. Genuine, uncontrollable fear. This was June of 845, the Viking Siege of Paris, and within hours, the most powerful Christian empire in Western Europe was about to do something unthinkable, something that would haunt the Franks for decades and send a signal to every raider, every warlord, and every opportunist on the continent that the empire of Charlemagne was no longer unbreakable. What happened next was not just a battle, it was a collapse, and nobody, not the king, not the bishops, not the soldiers on those riverbanks, was prepared for how fast it would happen. The man who had to stop this was King Charles the Bald. He was not Charlemagne. He was not even close. He had inherited a fractured empire torn apart by civil war among his own brothers, a military that had been fighting internal enemies for years, and a treasury that was bleeding out faster than his armies could replenish it. If Paris fell, it wasn't just a city lost. Paris was symbolic. Paris was the spiritual and commercial heart of the Frankish world. Churches filled with relics, monasteries stuffed with gold, the Abbey of Saint Denis, the burial place of Frankish kings, sitting directly in the path of the fleet moving upriver. Charles knew what was at stake. He had divided his forces into 2 armies and placed them on opposite banks of the Seine, hoping to catch the Vikings in a crossfire as they sailed through. It was a reasonable plan. It made tactical sense on paper. It was about to fall apart catastrophically. Ragnar, that was the name moving through the Frankish camps like a cold wind. The leader of this fleet was identified in later chronicles as Ragnar, possibly the same Ragnar Lothbrok of legend, possibly a commander who had borrowed the name as Terror, possibly someone whose real name was never recorded with full certainty. What mattered was not his name. What mattered was what he had already done. Before reaching Paris, this fleet had moved up the Seine with methodical, almost contemptuous efficiency. They had torched Rouen. They had raided every settlement along the river. They had demonstrated, clearly and repeatedly, that the Frankish military was not appearing to stop them. Every village burned was a message. Every monastery sacked was a question aimed directly at Charles the Bald. "Where are you?" The Frankish king had finally answered. He was here. Both armies, positioned on both banks, ready. What Ragnar saw when he looked at those 2 armies was not a trap. What he saw was an opportunity. One of those armies was smaller. One of those banks was weaker. And Ragnar had 7,000 men who had been rowing upstream for days, who were cold, who were angry, and who had not come this far to turn around. He was going to hit the weaker army first. And he was going to hit it so hard and so fast that the stronger army across the river would have no time to help. The Franks on the northern bank never saw the scale of it coming. The longships did not slow. They angled toward the bank in a coordinated rush, prows cutting through the current, shields up, axes drawn. The Frankish soldiers, already exhausted, already frightened, many of them conscripted farmers and regional levies rather than professional warriors, watched that wall of shields rise out of the water, and something broke in the formation before the first Viking boot even touched ground. Some of them ran. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough that the line cracked. And when a line cracks against Vikings, it does not crack slowly. The assault was overwhelming and merciless. What followed on that northern bank was not a battle in the tactical sense. It was a slaughter with geography. The Franks who tried to hold ground were cut down. The ones who ran were cut down from behind. The ones who tried to retreat to the river to cross to the southern bank found the current fighting them, found the longships between them in safety, found there was nowhere left to go. The army on the southern bank watched this happen, and did nothing. They were on the wrong side of the Seine. The current was strong. The Viking ships controlled the water. By the time any organized crossing could have been attempted, the northern army was already gone, broken, routed, hundreds of men dead or captured along a half-mile of riverbank. Charles the Bald had split his force to create a pincer. He had accidentally created 2 armies, neither able to help the other. Then came the part that would echo through history for reasons nobody anticipated. The prisoners. Ragnar had captured Frankish soldiers. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 100 and 110 men were taken alive on that bank, bound, and marched to the most visible high ground the Vikings could find. A place where both banks of the river could see clearly what was about to happen. They were hanged, all of them, simultaneously, in full view of the Frankish army on the southern bank, in full view of any survivors fleeing through the tree line, in full view of God, whose servants had been promising the Franks divine protection from pagan raiders for years. This was not random cruelty. This was a message, delivered with absolute precision. Ragnar was hanging those men as an offering to Odin, a sacrifice of war, a demonstration of dominance, a declaration that the old gods were watching and the Frankish god had not shown up. On the southern bank, among the soldiers of Charles the Bald, the effect was immediate. Men who had not broken during the slaughter across the water now broke. The will to fight, already shaken, evaporated. Plague had already been spreading through the Frankish camp. Some accounts describe it as dysentery, others as something worse. And in the context of a Norse raid interpreted through Frankish religious terror, it was not hard for men to believe they were being punished. Charles looked at his army. He looked at the river. He looked at Paris ahead, and at the Viking fleet between him and it. He made a decision so humiliating that his own chroniclers would spend years trying to justify it, reframe it, bury it in theological language, describe it as pragmatic statecraft. He was going to pay them to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver. Not a small ransom for a minor nobleman. Not a tribute from a village terrified of fire. 7,000 pounds of silver, paid by the crowned king of the Franks, the ruler of the most powerful Christian kingdom in Western Europe, to a Viking warlord who had just crucified his soldiers on the riverbank in view of his entire army. The negotiations were not fast. This was not Charles writing a check and watching longships disappear. This took days during which the Vikings camped where they wanted, moved where they wanted, burned the Abbey of Saint Denis, the sacred royal burial ground, the holiest site in the Frankish world, and reportedly laughed. Think about what those days felt like inside the Frankish camp. Officers trying to maintain discipline among men who had just watched comrades executed as pagan offerings. Priests trying to explain why God was allowing this. Soldiers watching smoke rise from Saint Denis and understanding, viscerally and permanently, that the men across the water were not afraid of anything the Franks could do. The silver was gathered. It was paid. And then Ragnar, true to the agreement, ordered the fleet to turn around. He sailed back down the Seine, past the burned villages, past the ruined monasteries, past the evidence of everything he had done on the way in. He made it back to the coast. He made it back across the North Sea. He went home. Here's what nobody says loudly enough about what happened next. Charles the Bald did not recover from this psychologically. The Frankish military did not recover from this institutionally. And the empire, the fragile, already cracking empire that Charlemagne had built and his grandsons had spent 30 years dismantling through civil war, did not recover from this politically. The payment of 845 was not the last Dane guild. It was the first. It was the proof of concept. It was the moment when every Viking warlord with ambition looked at the Frankish kingdom and understood, these people will pay. They have the silver. They do not have the stomach. Within years, the raids intensified, not just on Frankish territory, on the entire coastline of Western Europe. The signal Paris sent was received everywhere. The Franks could not protect their capital. They could not protect their sacred sites. They could not protect the burial ground of their own kings. If they couldn't do that, what could they protect? The raids that followed were not one-offs. They were systematic campaigns conducted by commanders who had watched what happened on the Seine and understood the logic perfectly. The formula was simple. Sail in, burn something important, wait for the silver. The Franks would pay. They always paid now. Paris would be besieged again. And again. The year 885 would bring another massive Viking fleet, over 700 ships, in a siege so enormous it would dwarf what Ragnar had done. The only difference was that by then, the Franks had found a different kind of leader, a count named Odo who would refuse to pay, refuse to surrender, and hold the city through a brutal year-long siege that would make him more beloved than the king himself. But that came later. In the summer of 845, there was only the silence after the longships disappeared around the river bend. The smoke from Saint Denis still rising, the silver gone, the dead unburied along the northern bank. Let me take you back to that northern bank for a moment. To one of those soldiers who ran. He is not a knight. He is not a trained cavalryman or a member of the Royal Household Guard. He is a farmer from somewhere in what is now northern France. conscripted because Charles needed bodies to fill a line. He has a spear that is too heavy, boots that have been wet for 3 days, and he has not slept properly since the fleet was spotted coming upriver. When the longships angle toward his bank, he can hear them before he can fully see them. The creak of oars, the low rhythmic sound of men breathing together, the scrape of hulls finding the shallows. The man next to him says something. He doesn't hear what? The man on his other side is already backing up. The first Vikings over the prow are not monsters. They are men, but they are running at full speed, screaming, with axes already moving, and they hit the line before the line is fully ready, and the line, soft in the middle, exhausted at the edges, gives. He runs. He doesn't decide to run in any thoughtful way. His body runs and his mind follows. He hears someone fall behind him, hears the sound of that, and runs harder. The trees. Get to the trees. Somewhere behind him, the screaming changes character, becomes something lower and more continuous, becomes the sound of a battle that has already been decided. He makes it to the tree line. He stops. He cannot catch his breath. He turns around and looks at what used to be his army. He watches the hangings from the trees. He is one of the ones who survives to tell someone what he saw. Most of the accounts we have from the Frankish side are filtered through monks and clergymen who were not on the riverbank. But somewhere in those monastic records, in the terrified language of men trying to explain to God and to posterity how this happened, is the voice of that farmer from the northern bank. He did not understand the politics. He did not understand the silver. He just knew that 7,000 men had come out of the fog on the Seine, and the empire had run. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things permanently. Not the comfortable silence after a storm passes. The silence of a house after something has broken inside it. The walls still standing. The roof still on, but something structural gone. And everyone inside knowing it, and nobody saying it out loud. Charles the Bald returned to his court, and his chroniclers began the slow work of making this sound like policy. The silver was framed as a pragmatic ransom. The retreat was framed as strategic patience. The burning of Saint Denis was not discussed in polite company. Ragnar, by some accounts, returned to Scandinavia and fell ill on the voyage home. Some sources say he died shortly after. Some say he lived. The legend absorbed him. He became the Ragnar of saga, the Ragnar who would send sons to avenge him, the Ragnar who conquered Paris and broke the Frankish wool in a single summer afternoon. Whether the historical figure and the legendary one are the same man has never been definitively settled. What was settled, permanently, was the pattern. The Viking Age was not caused by the raid on Paris. It had been building for decades, since the first longships hit Lindisfarne in 793. But Paris crystallized something. Paris made the age of raids into the age of conquest. The men who came after Ragnar, Rollo, who would eventually be given Normandy as a fief, the great heathen army that would nearly destroy Anglo-Saxon England, the commanders who would raid the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, Iceland, and eventually reach North America. All of them operated in a world that Paris had helped create. The Frankish Empire, already splitting along the fault lines of royal inheritance, cracked further after 845. The lords who could not rely on royal protection began building their own. The local strongmen who could actually defend a village became more powerful than distant kings who paid silver to make problems go away. The feudal system, the localized web of obligation and defense that would define medieval Europe for centuries, accelerated directly out of the failure of centralized Carolingian power. The seeds of what we now call France, Germany, and the borderlands between them were planted in the wreckage of Charles the Bald, his inability to hold the Seine. One fleet, one morning in June of 845, 7,000 pounds of silver. The price of an empire is confidence. And once that confidence was gone, it never fully returned. Walk the banks of the Seine today and the river looks nothing like it did that morning. The longships are gone. The hanging tree is gone. The smoke from Saint Denis has been absorbed into 1,000 years of Parisian air. The city that grew from the ashes of that summer is one of the most visited places on earth. Cathedrals and boulevards and lights reflected in the same water that carried 120 Viking ships through the fog. But under all of that, in the geological layer of memory that cities carry without knowing it, there is still that morning. There is still the sound of oars in the current. There is still the moment when the most powerful kingdom in the Western world looked at a fleet of raiders and blinked first. History does not forget the first time an empire flinches. It only records what came next. And what came next was a very long darkness for a very large empire. The Vikings didn't just take Paris that June. They took something the Franks could never buy back. If you made it this far, you already know this story is bigger than one battle. Drop a comment below. Do you think Charles the Bald made the right call paying the ransom? Or did that single decision doom the Carolingian Empire? I genuinely want to know what you think. If this hit differently than the usual history content, hit subscribe. There are stories coming that make this one look calm. And if someone, still thinks the Vikings were just raiders in horned helmets, send them this video. The truth is so much stranger.